Poka Laenui, and welcome back to A Second Glance. In this particular program, we take actually part 2 of a perspective on Hawaii's statehood. And in an earlier program, we covered some of the preliminaries with regards to this subject. We talked about the fact that the state legislature has created a commission to celebrate the 50th anniversary of statehood. And rather than really giving depth to the issue of statehood, it seems to be merely in a celebratory and a reminiscent approach towards statehood, the events that occurred 50 years ago. In this program and in other television shows that you will find on Olelo stations, you will see that there is an attempt to look deeper behind merely the celebration, merely the reminiscence, and look at the question of whether or not statehood, first of all, was or was not legitimate. And then look at the next question of whether or not Hawaii would actually have been better off had it not been for statehood, but let's say for another status such as independence or free association. And those were the opportunities that we should have been given back in 1959, but were not given those opportunities. I've covered many of those international obligations that the United States was under in an earlier program, and rather than doing that, what we'll do is jump right into the discussion and go back to our diagram as we're talking about, not the diagram, but these comments that I had on the newsprint, and go back and talk about what events had occurred. We've so far talked about 1945, the creation of the United Nations, 1946, the first General Assembly in which the United States submitted to the United Nations a list of places that should be decolonized, that the United States was acting as the administering authority. And Hawaii, of course, was one of those of the places that the United States itself submitted to the United Nations. The United Nations then took that list and placed it on a broader list of places to be decolonized. One of the places included Puerto Rico. Now, in 1952, the United States went into Puerto Rico and gave the Borinqueños, or what we call in Hawaii the Borinquis, gave the Puerto Ricans the right to choose to be in free association with the United States or to remain a territory. So that was in 1952. After the Puerto Ricans chose to be in free association with the United States or to act as a commonwealth, essentially the same status, the United States ran over to the United Nations and reported to the United Nations that the people of Puerto Rico have chosen, and in its exercise of self-determination, it chose to be in commonwealth with the United States. 1959 rolls along. Actually, before 59, 1958 rolls along. The United States places a question before the people of Alaska, asking them, shall Alaska be immediately admitted into the Union as a state? The Alaskan people are given an option, yes or no. If you vote yes, you become a state of the United States. If you vote no, then you remain a territory of the United States. The other options, independence or free association, were never on that ballot. In 1959, the United States also comes to Hawaii, or places the question in Hawaii, essentially the identical question as Alaska, but for the change in names. The question again is, shall Hawaii be immediately admitted into the Union? You can either vote yes or no. But the options of independence or free association was never on that ballot. Not only that, but in the question of Alaska and in the question of Hawaii, the people who participated in this grand exercise of self-determination was not the self that had been occupied. It was not the self that had been colonized. It was not the self that the United Nations was trying to address. Instead, the people who were allowed to participate were people who had been transmigrated into these territories. And then they had the requirement that only American citizens who had lived within these territories for at least 1 year were authorized to engage in that vote. What about the many people in Hawaii, or there may not have been many at that point, but at least there were people in Hawaii who still felt a particular loyalty to Liliuokalani, to the concept of an independent nation, and somewhere had the dream of being an independent nation. What about the people who had never heard about the Hawaii history of overthrow, takeover, and the rest? Just as many of the people in Alaska had not heard of the Russian sale to the United States of their territory and the illegalities that occurred there. Those discussions were never raised, those options were never given, and only the American citizens were allowed to vote, which included, as I said before, many of the people who had transmigrated into the territories of Alaska and Hawaii. For Hawaii, it also included many of the U.S. military who had been in Hawaii for at least 1 year. They all participated in the vote. 1958, Alaska. 1959, in June of 1959, Hawaii. Then the United States ran over to the United Nations and announced that the people of Hawaii, as well as the people of Alaska, have exercised their right of self-determination, and in that exercise chose to be a member of the Union of States of the United States of America. The United Nations, not understanding any other perspective, and many people in Hawaii had not realized that we had these rights, the United Nations applauded the United States and took Alaska and Hawaii off of the list of places to be decolonized. So if you went to, wanted to do any research, and you would find in General Assembly Resolution 1469, you will find a reference, or you will find that in that resolution, the General Assembly lifted Hawaii and Alaska off of the list of places to be decolonized. Okay. So what does that mean? Does that mean that there went our opportunity? Now Hawaii is dead as an independent nation? And is there any possibility of reopening that question, asking ourselves, do we want the opportunity to vote, or is that all gone? You know, sometimes people point out to me that you can only bite the apple once. The right to self-determination is given to you only at one time. You cannot have a second bite of the apple. You already ate the apple once. My response to those people is that the right to self-determination has been regarded as the father and the mother of all human rights. It's so central as a principle that it is not your apple. There's no such thing as you can only bite it once. For example, let's take a look at this concept of the right of free speech. Does it mean that once you have spoken in the public, or you have written a letter to the editor, or given a speech and expressed yourself on that issue, that you cannot exercise free speech ever again? Of course not. And what about the right to fair trial? Does it mean that you only have one opportunity to have a fair trial, and from then on all of the trials that you have is no longer fair? Of course not. That's not how civil rights, human rights work. The right to self-determination is not an apple that once eaten you cannot exercise it again. And to go back again, we never exercised self-determination. In 1959, that was not self-determination. That was an altered self. It was an Americanized, transmigrated self that exercised limited choice. In fact, some would say no choice. We were entitled to 3 basic choices. Those choices were, number 1, sovereign independent state. Number 2, free association with the United States. Number 3, integration with an independent state, and of course that would have been the United States. Instead, we were given only one choice, integration as a state of the United States, and nothing else. And if we didn't want that choice, then we remained a territory of the United States. Notice that territory of the United States is not what the United Nations said we should be entitled to. Okay. So that's the history now of the United States going to the United Nations and submitting Hawaii to the United Nations as having exercised a choice, and we now being taken off the list of places to be decolonized. Other things began to happen in the year after that, 1960. In 1960, the United Nations got kind of disenchanted, unhappy with the situation that was going on with regards to decolonization, the process of decolonization. So in 1960, the United Nations passed two very important resolutions. The first was Resolution 1514, and the second is Resolution 1541. And they both dealt with the right of decolonization. You know, when you come to decolonization, and in this case, the United Nations now created a special committee on decolonization. It said that decolonization, like slavery, like piracy, is such a major crime that we consider it to be a universal international crime that we will not tolerate. And so they said in this special committee on decolonization, we shall have a group of, I forget the number, 21 or so many members of the United Nations as a special committee to review the situations of colonization, or what they call colonization-like situations, and we will open the question as to whether or not the administering power has treated these people fairly. So in 1960, the resolution was passed, the special committee was formed. Some people tell me, well, this occurred in 1960. It was in 1959, the year before that, that the General Assembly had already taken Hawaii off of the list of places to be decolonized. If it is the later year, you cannot go back and say, oh, by the way, we want to be included. Toss us in and reconsider the question of decolonization. Because it's too late. It's sort of like the horses have already ran out of the barn, and you cannot close the barn door now and expect the horses to be back in the barn. Okay. You know, it's interesting that just as our right to self-determination is not an apple, the right to self-determination is not a barn or a barn door, and we are not horses. You see, what happened was, in 1960, as the General Assembly debated Resolution 1514 and 1541, people had foreseen this argument. And they were saying, well, what about those places that have already been taken off of the list? And it was clarified on the General Assembly floor that what we are doing is not creating new law for 1960 and onward, but what we are simply doing is clarifying what we meant in 1945 and in 1946. So what they did was say, reassert that we are stretching back to that earlier time and defining what were the rights that existed at that earlier time. Okay? So the right to self-determination, the opportunity for all of these choices actually were the rights that we were entitled to back in 1945, 1946. Now let's take a look at further events that have occurred, and to a certain extent the people of Hawaii has been able to become more attenuated or more aware of what is happening. Because as you look through the Pacific, a lot of exciting stuff was happening once the special committee came out for decolonization. Beginning in 1970, let's take a look at what happened to the Pacific area. You have, first of all, Fiji, which became an independent nation. And following Fiji, you had Nauru, that also became independent. Tuvalu, an independent nation. Kiribati, oftentimes mispronounced Kiribati, but it's Kiribati. In the Hawaiian language, we call it Gilipaki, or the Gilbert Islands. So that's what Kiribati had been known as previously. Independent nation. Western Samoa, with maybe an extra A there. Western Samoa Also now an independent nation. You got Papua New Guinea, independent nation. Also, when you have Papua New Guinea, there's also West Papua, which is still occupied by the Indonesians, and they will not appreciate my making this reference. But you have West Papua still colonized. Then you have the Cook Islands, named after who? That's him, James Cook. Over a period of years, and I had the opportunity to interview the Prime Minister of the Cook Islands, and he had mentioned that they were considering renaming the island because it's not the best name to choose. A white man who is said to have discovered that there were people on these islands. But they haven't resolved that question yet. What would they call it? So as far as I know, it's still called the Cook Islands. Now, after that, you also had Niue, which has been in the news, and we have people now living in Hawaii who had come from Niue. Vanuatu. Vanuatu? Where is Vanuatu? Vanuatu was also known as the New Hebrides. Why do we have these names such as New this and New that, like New York and New Hebrides and this new, even in the Pacific? It's just a reflection of the colonizers renaming a place. So they're not happy with Hebrides, so they name it New Hebrides, indicating that it's a colonized area. So Vanuatu became an independent nation, and then you had the flow of even more nations that now had been previously occupied by the Americans. But in a sort of a different way, they were under what is called a secured trust territory. And many of you are familiar with that name, trust territories. Oh, that's where a lot of our people went to work, in the trust territories. Well, part of the trust territories was the Marshall Islands, and it became an independent nation, the Marshall Islands. Then you have the Northern Marianas, now known as the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas Islands. When you deal with the issue of Commonwealth, it's always a question exactly what are the terms of relationship with the United States and the rest. But the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas are regarded as an independent nation. You have the Republic of Palau. Sometimes we used to know it as Palau. Now an independent nation, still in a struggle with the United States. The United States insists that in order to get your independence, you got to let us put our military bases on these islands, and you cannot, or you can ask us, but we will not tell you whether or not we have nuclear weapons in your island. The Republic of Palau was one of the leaders in the Pacific who said that we need to clean up the Pacific. We will not allow any nuclear devices in our territory. Instead, what they did was say, in order to get your independence, you must agree to let us stay in your bases, and we need not disclose whether or not we have nuclear weapons on our ships. And of course, we all know what the situation is. Yes, the Americans do have nuclear weapons in Palau. The Federated States of Micronesia, I don't know if this is too low, but again, another independent nation. And so you have a lot of people from Micronesia, from Palau, the Northern Marianas, and a lot of these, trust territories, formerly trust territories, that now in fact live in Hawaii, especially after the United States has, to a certain extent, destroyed a lot of their land, including the Bikini Atoll with the explosion or the testing of nuclear weapons, which was then tested on the folks not only in Nevada but in Japan, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Of course, a very sad story. Maybe some other time we can talk more about that. So that is what has happened in the 1970s, 30-something years ago. And in the meantime, you have Hawaii, you have Puerto Rico, and to some extent, believe it or not, people in Alaska, who are taking a look at the question of independence and why weren't we given that as an option. So in about the 1970s, I know I was going through the United States Air Force, and following that I then went to law school, looking more and more at the question of the options that we were entitled to have, but we were basically cheated out of. That's the same thing that happened, as I said earlier, to the people in Puerto Rico as well as in Alaska. So we are raising that question now with specific regard to Puerto Rico. You know, Puerto Rico had been taken off of the list of places to be decolonized, and then in the 1980s they started going back to the United Nations and said, hey, wait a minute, we didn't have the opportunity to choose free association or independence or remaining integrated with the United States of America. We were only told free association or remaining a territory. That wasn't fair. They went to the Special Committee on Decolonization, 1984, 1985, 1986, 1987. They kept banging on these doors. And there was a particular person, whose name was Miguel Alfonso Martinez, the representative of all places of the nation of Cuba. And I had spoken with Miguel Alfonso. And he said, you know, I'm very proud that I was a representative on that special committee, and I was a person who they came to, and I began to open up these doors, asking the question of Puerto Rico. The United States would say, hey, you folks cannot touch the issue of Puerto Rico because you have already taken them off of the list of places to be decolonized. The special committee says, no, that's not the situation. We can enter into any situation in which we find a colonial relationship and reopen that question. Okay. The United States kept insisting, no, you can't. The special committee from the United Nations says, yes, we can. And so you had that thing going back and forth with regards to Puerto Rico. There was another situation in the Pacific. The place called New Caledonia, also known as Kanaki, had been placed on the list of territories to be decolonized. The French were responsible for decolonizing it. And back in the 1950s or 60s, the French pulled this place off of the list of places to be decolonized because all of France voted that they should not have independence, they should not be in free association, they should merely remain part of France as I think it's called a dom or a tom, a territory of France, an integrated territory of France. The Kanakis were saying, wait a minute, that's not fair, we weren't given a fair choice, and we want to be replaced back on the list of places to be decolonized. The French said, no, we're not going to let you come back on. The Americans supported the French. The English supported the Americans. So you had these strong powers who refused to let France be, Kanaki be reinscribed. What happened was that the United Nations General Assembly finally took a vote. And by that time, in the 1990s, or late 1980s, the General Assembly had switched, had turned, so that the General Assembly was now made up of a lot of decolonized countries, or independent countries that went through this process of decolonization. And the General Assembly says, no, irrespective of what France says, irrespective of what the United States says, we are going to reinscribe France on the place of, or list of places to be decolonized. And as a result, that occurred, and France, Kanaki was placed back on the list. So what am I saying? I'm saying that once taken off the list, it does not mean that we cannot be placed back on the list. What right do we have to be placed back on the list? Well, it's very simple. That when the action was taken to take us off the list, it wasn't legitimate. It was a double fraud. So there's still opportunity for Hawaii to be placed back on the list of places to be decolonized. Don't give up hope, although there is a celebration of statehood now going on with regards to others who are not as well informed as you are now that you have had the opportunity to see this program. And what we need to do is continue to educate, continue to show that people, there really should be no celebration when there is nothing to celebrate, or when one recognizes that it was a fraud. One does not celebrate a fraudulent transaction. I want to thank you again for joining me, and we'll be back to talk more about these kinds of stuff. Aloha Hawaii, ahui ho.